Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. We're going to start off today's show by discussing Myanmar. And of course, ever since the military carried out a coup in that country, there has been unrest on the streets across Myanmar, with protesters coming out on the streets against that coup that took place and the downfall of the Aung San Suu Kyi government ever since the junta has taken over. We now have a number of armed groups, around 3, I believe it is, that have come out and said that they may very well stand up and defend the protesters. And this could, of course, and it's important not to overstate this, could mean that civil war is coming. Myanmar is no stranger to a civil war of sorts, especially in areas where you have specific rebel groups which rule or try to rule at the very least. It is made up of, I believe, a patchwork of rebel groups, around 20 or so, from what I was reading and understanding about the country. So what does this mean then going forward right now when these 3 come out and say that they may very well stand with these demonstrators? Will they then pick up arms to do so? Is that what they're trying to indicate at this time? Well, let's discuss all of that a bit further. I'm joined by Dr. Kerstin Duell, who is a political analyst and consultant for civil society context analysis. She's joining us today from Berlin. Joining us today from Turin is Dr. Stefano Ruzza, who is an associate professor of political science at the University of Turin. He's also the head of the Torino World Affairs Institute. Stefano and Kerstin, thank you both for taking our time out to join us today. Kerstin, let me start with you. What kind of a sign is this, do you think, of the rebel groups too now are siding with the protesters? Is there conflict coming?
Well, conflict has actually never stopped in this country. So I think generally it's a very good sign that they express solidarity with the protesters. That has not happened in '88. So this is a huge departure from the past, from '88 and from 2007. It also means that the Tatmadaw will have to be fighting on different fronts. And so far they have been trying to avoid that because they're obviously deploying their forces everywhere across the country against the so far unarmed protesters.
Okay, so Stefano, and that's a fair point, of course, the Kerstin there made, that conflict has never really stopped, but can it become a lot worse in the coming days?
So, in my opinion, basically the big difference is not going to come directly from these 3 groups specifically, because these 3 groups have been in an open state of conflict with the government already for about more than a decade, each one of them. The real risk there for the junta right now is if other groups decided to join the fray, and actually we have some signs are going in that direction coming from other major ethnic armed organizations active in the country. More specifically, the Karen National Union has manifested to be very uneasy with the new military government which has installed. And it has been reported that there have been military clashes between the Karen National Union and the Tatmadaw already, the last case of which is actually the bombing, the air bombing, which happened during the weekend. And also we have the Restoration Council of Shan State, another big ethnic armed organization which is active in the northeast of the country. They as well have been at peace with the government, and they as well have denounced the coup very strongly and have had already some clashes with the Tatmadaw. So I think the real balance here hangs in what's going to be done by the groups which currently have a ceasefire with the government and may want actually to revise this position.
Okay, so then how much of a threat, Kerstin, is this really to the junta? I mean, I would think that considering this has been happening for a very long time, the junta pretty much knows how to deal with this.
Well, first of all, I think it's important, again, another repetition of '88, that you have the CRPH setting up in KNU territory. I don't think we will be seeing any ethnic soldiers marching into the cities, into Mandalay and Yangon. That is highly unlikely. So when they say they will fight the government, that will always only be in their own areas, as far as I expect. But I think we have to make a very important distinction here. We have ethnic armed movements that have a very strong political identity in history. Then we have militias involved in all sorts of illicit trades. And we have other ethnic groups who don't really have a political program, especially the United War State Army. They're residues, they're break-apart factions of the former Communist Party of Burma that broke away in 1989, sorry. And so the WA have 20 to 30,000 soldiers. And as far as I know, they haven't made any statement yet. And they're at the Chinese border and usually receive their arms from China. So they couldn't care less about any Burma marching anywhere or any other protesters. So I think these will be decisive. They have also, I would say, derailed the peace process.
Okay, so then what do the coming days then hold then, Stefano? I mean, this seems like a fairly confusing patch of different people with different groups, pardon me, with varying interests. What does this mean for protesters? Does this mean anything will actually change, or does this mean that things will continue as they have so far, with the junta continuing to kill protesters who come out? And I would think that will just become worse.
Well, I mean, if I have to address that question directly, I think the main issue on the table here is about the amount of, let's say, people and resources that the ethnic armed organization are going to, let's say, divert away from repressing the manifestation ongoing in all of Myanmar's major cities. So we can try to make some basic, let's say, math about the numbers of people and the actual military power that the different ethnic armed organization can mobilize in order to make sense about how much of a distraction they may become for the Tatmadaw. And I would say that currently speaking, we have about, let's say, TNLA, AA, and the MNDAA, the three groups that said that they're ready to carry open-out war with the government. They factor in about, let's say, 14,000 effective. If we add the KIO, the Kachin Independence Organization, which is active in the north, they have another 12,000. They can add to the numbers there, but they are as well in a state of open war with the government since 2011. So, as I mentioned before, where the math here starts to change is when you bring in the other groups which have been into a separate ceasefire. And I agree with Kerstin there. Basically, we have some groups which have a very clear, let's say, ethno-nationalist agenda, which state that they are going to, not respect ceasefire during this time, because the ceasefire they had with a legitimate government, and they don't recognize the legitimacy of this government. So the ceasefire are going to be suspended for the time being. But even if all of them are going to, let's say, suspend the ceasefire and enter the fray, this is going to bring the numbers up to, let's say, 40,000 effective against the Tatmadaw, which is about, let's say, 400,000. It's 10 times bigger. So I think the ratio there of forces will still be advantageous for the Tatmadaw. The real trouble would become only if the United Wa State Army and all the other splinters cells of the Communist Party of Burma, let's say all these insurgencies which are in northeast Shan State, will join the fray. And I would think it's not going to happen quite easily. The United Wa State Army is 30,000 strong, is the biggest ethnic armed organization in Burma, but has been on the sideline basically of everything since 1989, since the beginning of its existence.
Right.
I think it's going to be interested in joining only if China is going to change its position with regard to the Myanmar's government.
Okay, so Kerstin, can these rebel groups join? I mean, does the hatred or for the junta unite them? I mean, is that even an issue for them, considering they've been able to get away with a lot of their own illicit activities within their regions for so long? I mean, I would think that there's not as much hatred. Maybe this is just political opportunism at this time.
I think there's no question that most of them reject the Burma Tatmadaw outrightly. So it's not about hatred; it's about practicality. I had interviewed the late Mancha of the KNU leader, and already in that time, I think it was 2005, he told me, Kerstin, we can only put a dent in the side of the Tatmadaw. We cannot totally overcome them. So at least the ethnic identity movements, they're very, very clear on how much they can achieve, but they definitely want to protect their own people, their own minorities. But right now they're realizing that, of course, I mean, the Tatmadaw, the coup, is destroying the entire country. It's bringing near to a collapse. Many commentators talk about a failed state right now. So I think it's in everybody else's interest to side with the, well, I don't know whether you can already call it an exile government of sorts, and the protesters. None of these groups particularly cares for the Tatmadaw, but I think especially in the north, again, you mentioned illicit trades. There we have the world's most significant amphetamine trade. There we have a lot of other interests at stake. You can only guess.
Okay. I'll give you the final word before I let both of you go. What should we then be looking for in the coming days, do you think, when it comes to how these groups act? I mean, are we looking for them to pick up arms? Is that what we should be looking for? What exactly, and where should we keep our eyes on when it comes to Myanmar?
I think first thing to look for is going to be, as a matter of fact, the actual action which are going to be taken by the Karen National Union and the Restoration Council of Shan States. So having a look at the northeast and the east of the country. The east has been at peace, an easy peace for a while, and this can actually change. Diverting some of the attention of the Tatmadaw is going to be the first thing. And then perhaps forward in the future, what the United Wa State Army is going to do, which is directly dependent, I would say, by the policy adopted by China regarding the junta government in Myanmar. It's the only thing that I think is going to make a substantial difference. Otherwise, I believe that the Tatmadaw and the military government do have the means and the tools to try to handle this. They have been, very shrewd player at a divide and rule game for decades now, and they have been using these cards already during the current crisis. They have been trying to, create cleavages between the ethnic parties and the ethnic armed organization in several parts of the country now, and I think this policy is going to stay in the future as well. So it's going to be difficult for the civil disobedience movement to actually get a substantial support helpful to their cause by the ethnic armed organization.
Very well. There that, but we really appreciate both of our experts for joining us today. That was Kerstin speaking to us from Berlin, and Stefano was speaking to us from Turin. They were shedding light and contextualizing Myanmar for us. I mean, as I was been reading and as they've described, this is a confusing patch and myriad of different rebel groups with different varying interests, both external and otherwise, and they have different influences playing upon them, be it the illicit activities that they may be involved in, the drug trade or other such activities, as well as, of course, as I mentioned already, external influences from other countries in the region. But then on top of that, does this then mean that they will in fact be aligning with the protesters? Do their interests actually align with the protesters? Yes, they may hate the Tatmadaw as much as the protesters currently do, but then does that mean that they will be able to act in a united fashion as all of the groups against the junta? That seemingly is an unlikely prospect. Of course, though, that may very well change in the coming days if they do unite and try to stand up for the protesters against the junta's continuing killings of protesters who've come out on the streets against the coup. We'll keep a close eye on that, of course, here in Scope. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. We're going to begin this segment by discussing the UK. And we've had, of course, a review seemingly carried out by the UK government through its Race Commission and its official response, essentially, to the racial justice movements in that country, have suggested that the country should, in fact, be seen as an example for other countries who do also have racial tensions within them. And they're talking more specifically, from what I've understood, of course, and I may be wrong on this, as more Western countries. These are, of course, questions I will put to our guests in just a moment. Now, this was a highly anticipated report, but it has not gone the way, seemingly, of what racial justice advocates would want, where they would want, of course, the government to accept that there is systemic racism. And the government has said that there is no structural racism in place, in fact, and any such statements are, in fact, an overstatement of the reality on the ground. Government talking about broad progress that has been made in regards to race relations, especially, I believe, within the schooling system, etc. And, of course, none of that is to be denied, but it just doesn't, again, deny the fact that there is structural racism, that there are very much race issues within the system as it currently stands as well. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. And I'm joined by Rabina, who is a Liberal Democrat councillor and special advisor. She's joining us today from London. Joining us today from Leeds is Dr. Shona Hunter, who is a reader in the Centre for Race, Education and Decoloniality at Leeds Beckett University. Shona and Rabina, thank you both for taking our time out to join us today. Rabina, let me start with you. Of course, it's no surprise that everyone's really angry about this report that has come out. What are your thoughts about it?
Well, my thoughts are this. I reflect on the times I came to this country in 1972, and my father came to the UK as a young man. And whilst we have made many strides in addressing racism from the Race Relations Act, there is still structural inequality within our institutions. And it's quite interesting because the report states that it rejects institutional racism in Britain, but it also yet calls out racism amongst individuals, which exists. Now, it's very easy. Britain is very good at calling out racism amongst individuals and persons, but what it isn't very good at is calling out structural inequalities in institutions. So an example of this within the report is that it doesn't include or mention the fact that young black men are 9 times more likely to be jailed than white young men. It doesn't also reflect on the fact that whilst Bangladeshi and Indian young students are doing very, very well within the education system, the fact is there is a high level of unemployment amongst graduates from Black and Asian and ethnic minority communities. So we have to question those kind of systemic problems that exist in Britain. Another example which I looked into, I found very, very appalling, is the fact that we have had 60,000 reports of racist incidents in schools. Now, in 2017, the government introduced guidance that schools do not have to record any form of bullying or racist incidents within the schools. And then you see the spike going up. Again, a systemic problem that exists through policy.
Shona, what are your thoughts on this? Because, you know, it's one thing to say we do not have structural racism and to just come out and deny that. But then it's quite another thing to say and to then boast that, in fact, we should be an example for other countries. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, okay. Well, I'd like to start with this issue of what actually institutional racism and structural racism is before I think about whether we're an example as a country or not, which I don't really think we are. But the issue of structural and systemic racism that was kind of taken issue with by Tony Sewell in his interview in the British News yesterday and in the report actually is a way of thinking about racism that brings together ideas of culture, ideas of material inequalities, and ideas of the relationships between people and individuals. So it's a very expansive, but also a very precise way of understanding how social inequality is reproduced on multiple different levels. And the Macpherson report, which was kind of the very important piece of very much more extensive kind of commission work that was done in relation to the systemic problems within the criminal justice system, which was then extended out to become applicable across all institutions or public bodies anyway in the English context. Was a really important step forward. Its findings in 1999 and then the bringing into the statute and the way we understand our institutional spaces in 2000 were very, very important steps forward to understanding the complexities that are really denied in the context of this report. Right. So I think there's that first. And I think this idea that we are an exemplar as a country, well, I think your other guest, Rabina, there has just shown the sorts of figures and the sorts of realities that people who are racialised as Black, Brown and minority ethnic in the context of the UK kind of come up against time and time again. And our responses to this as a country are highly problematic. And one of the things I was dismayed about, really, in relation to the way the report and the Commission's work were introduced was via this notion of being a beacon for white majority nation, which is a language which is really, really highly problematic, I think, in all sorts of contexts, in a global context and also in a national context.
You know, Rabina, I wonder, what does this then mean? I mean, we obviously, I imagine, and I wonder if we were expecting better from the government at this time. A, I wanted to get your thoughts on that. And B, does this then mean that we're going to continue to have this sort of head in the sand, sort of, you know, just outright denial of racism, or in this fashion that we're talking about, at least, systemic racism, that is, and that will not then be dealt with in the UK properly?
I think, first of all, the reason why this report was commissioned, let's not forget, it was in the light of COVID and the Black Lives Matter protest. And COVID outlined the inequalities, the structural inequalities by which Black and Asian and minority communities were twice as likely to be affected by the pandemic in Britain. The Black Lives Matter then happened as well. And let's not forget the Windrush generation, in which we saw generations of Black people being deported and the inequalities that they faced, the racism in which they, the context of the Windrush generation. What we have realised, what we have to also remember is that when the report was first commissioned, there was already cause as to who the commissioners were. There were concerns as to why and whether or not the lived experiences of people in Britain would be amplified within the report. And clearly, what I've read through the report is that we haven't seen the lived experiences of people from Black and Asian and ethnic minority communities. And we've also got to remember, Britain by 2061 will be a hugely diverse populated country. I believe it's about 42% of the population will be ethnically diverse, and we should be a reflection of that population. And just on a one note of, I mentioned my father at the beginning. I still recall my father telling me when he first attempted to get a bank loan all those years ago, 40 years ago, and the bank manager refused to give him a bank loan because he wanted to buy a property. He had the money, he met all the mortgage guidelines. He had to take his white manager with him to verify the fact that he as a Black man could do this. Now, all these years later, we still see financial exclusion amongst Black and ethnic minority communities. The systemic inequalities are rife, they still exist. And we as a country need to embrace that, understand it, and move on, not reject it through the report that we've just seen yesterday.
This sort of deniability on the part of the government obviously doesn't change facts on the ground, right, as the realities that people on a daily basis are living through. But you know, if the government does continue to deny it, that does then take away from the progress that can be made if it were to accept it, right? So what I'm trying to say is that, do you think that this will be a huge obstacle then, this sort of deniability on the part of the government to actually dealing with race issues, which are increasingly important? I mean, even under the context of the pandemic, we saw that, racism, within the healthcare system, within, many different fields, even jobs, etc. All of that became increasingly important issues.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's such an important question. And I think there's kind of two ways to think about that. I think government pronouncements are quite clearly important. They set a frame, right? They set a frame for the debate, potentially anyway, or at least a frame that has to be engaged with on some level. But I think the work that I do in, as a teacher in the university, in terms of my research, in terms of what I know, in terms of, again, what Rabina's just spoken about there, the experiences of people from Black and minority ethnic communities and from white communities right across the board. People are working really, really hard together often to really change this situation of gross structural disadvantage that works along the dimension of race. And people are doing that within institutional context and external to institutional context. And so I am not clear that government pronouncements will stop that. And actually, I think that this sort of reporting and analysis on the part of the Commission's report, actually spurs those of us that are doing this work on to continue to work together and to continue to debunk the sort of myths that are being constructed in higher level policy conversations. I think this is really important. As a school, the School of Education that I work in, We work externally with activists, we work with professionals across all sorts of different contexts, doing really, really important work on the ground with school children, with teachers, in schools, across the health services, and that work will not stop. Yeah. Absolutely not. Although some of the more worrying parts of the report are some of the recommendations around neutrality and fairness and this sort of thing, because again, they are a misframing of how structures, institutional places, and the broader society works. Society is not neutral. It is a cultural dynamic. Yeah. It's, so there are worrying things, but that will not stop the work. And I think that's really important to remember.
Indeed. We'll be the final word as we're quickly running out of time. There's racism, of course, and we can talk about racism towards many groups, of course, the Black community within the UK, and then, of course, the Asian community as well within the context of the pandemic, the East Asian community more specifically. And then overall, we can talk about Islamophobia, we can talk about a whole bunch of racism towards, the Sikh community, Hindu community, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, the list is quite endless, but considering there isn't acceptance on the surface of it, at least, of racism as a whole, is there need then for all of the above communities to come together and fight this at a grassroots level? And I'm sure, of course, that's happening, and that's why the progress has been made in these ensuing years.
Firstly, this report yesterday gives justification to people who want the narrative that institutional racism doesn't exist. So it's given that justification to them. So secondly to this, what is very sad is that we as people of colour have to keep justifying our identities, our lived experiences, our experiences of racism and institutional racism. And finally, as communities, we can still be able to challenge institutional racism. We have to, because for generations to come, we need to make sure in Britain that we have a more equitable and more transparent, open and more tolerant Britain than what we have today. Yes, we have moved on, and I applaud that. But actually, if we want to do better, and we have to keep doing better, is to call out institutional racism, appreciate people's lived experiences of what they feel like, and the fact that we have to keep justifying our identities and our experiences. I want to be in a stage that we don't have to do that.
Very well. We'll leave it there at that, but we really appreciate both Rabina and Shona for taking their time out of their busy schedules to speak to us today and to share their expertise with us. We were discussing there this report that's come out by the UK government, essentially denying outright that there is systemic racism, that there's a structural issue within the country when it comes to race relations and how different races are dealt with on the part of the system and establishment itself. And then, of course, there's the issue of boasting then to the rest of the world that actually we're an example that the rest of you should be following when it comes to how exactly you should be dealing with races of different kinds. And no one, again, is denying, as we've spoken of, that there has been very important progress made in these years. So it's not to say that Britain as a society has not progressed and has made things much better for varying minorities and varying ethnicities. However, for it to then boast that it is an example for the rest of us is a moral authority and a pedestal which is simply too high if we're completely honest with ourselves. I'll be back with my final segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Okazaki. Now, in this segment, we're going to discuss racism within the United States and hate crimes more specifically. The U.S. Attorney General has launched a 30-day review of how exactly the department and the country deals and should be combating hate crimes, which, as we know, within the context of the pandemic, unfortunately, have increased significantly, especially towards the Asian American community, but also, of course, other minorities as well. And these have been issues which are long-standing, so it's not like new targeting of Asian Americans and or African Americans or others. These are issues that have been there even from before the pandemic began, but it has become a lot worse because of the pandemic and the rhetoric that was used by, for example, the previous government while it was in office. We've also had a survey which has come out, which has said that around 1 in 4 Asian Americans have experienced a hate incident, while more than 2/3 have been asked, in fact, where they're really from. Again, always having that exclusionary language and rhetoric and viewpoint when it comes to others, really, to those who do not look Caucasian, essentially, if we're completely honest. Let's discuss all of those issues a bit further. I'm joined by Dr. Johnny Eric Williams, who's a professor of sociology at Trinity College. He's joining us this morning from Hartford, Connecticut. Joining us from New York, is Dr. Sumie Okazaki, who is a professor of applied psychology at New York University Steinhardt School of Culture, Education, and Human Development. Sumie and Johnny, thank you both for taking your time out this morning to speak to us. Sumie, I'd like to start with you, if I may. What do you make of the poll, firstly, if I may, about how many Asian Americans have experienced hate incidents over this time frame, especially over the past year? Again, not a new issue. This has been a long-standing issue. There's a history of targeting of Asian Americans, but the fact that it's become worse, how does one then combat that?
So I think, thank you for calling attention to this issue. I think, as you say, hate and discrimination, feelings of xenophobic, anti-Asian sentiments are not new. But certainly, I think in the last year during the pandemic, this sense that Asian Americans are being targeted because of our race has become acute, and the recent spate of violent incidents and attacks and mass shootings of Asian Americans have certainly brought that to the fore. And it's a complicated issue in terms of how to combat that. I mean, I think it's it has to be done on multiple levels. On one hand, we want to raise awareness that Asian Americans are having particular types of racialized experience as minorities, and that, this is a time for us to be able to educate the larger American public about our experience. But at the same time, I think there are also larger government and policy changes that need to be made to be able to track these incidents of hate much more closely.
Johnny, how does one deal with this, in your opinion, in the sense that we've always known that there have been and has been racism, but I mean, it becomes worse, unfortunately, when one is going through a pandemic, even though one would have thought that this would, in fact, brought the country together?
Well, there seems to be, there's two problems. One, the discourse of hate seem to be about individuals, not about the actual two structures that are causing people to engage in this kind of behavior. So it seems to be, the legislation that people are proposing, like Grace Mean in the Congress, is about hate incidents, and that's the key word. I mean, it's bias incidents that people are talking about, and those can just be prejudice that are non-criminal, right? Even non-violent, just those kinds of things. And that's the thing that they're legislating. They're not really legislating the root source of the process itself, that is, of these acts of criminal behavior in terms of physical violence against Asian Americans and so forth. So it becomes problematic that this is the legislation that is put forth rather than the one that actually get to the source of the problem, which is white racism itself, right, and whiteness. But the United States government is never prepared to address that particular issue because it goes to the root of the problem.
Okay, so, Sumie, we've had a number of incidents. We just recently had one in New York, I believe, of elderly Asian Americans being targeted as well on the streets. And, no one really acted to defend, at least in this latest incident that I watched the video of. There's also then that issue, right, where the rest of the public, I mean, at least when these things happen, don't act. And I really wonder, why do you think that is, that bystander effect, essentially, in these many cases of racism? And again, this can probably cross different ethnicity lines as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think the previous speakers writes that, I think what we're ultimately working toward is not so much, punishment of particular perpetrators. So of course we want, justice brought to individual cases, but at the same time, I think to overly focus on, most egregious incidents, such as the ones that we've witnessed in the last couple of days in New York City, in terms of bystanders standing by, just I think in some ways frozen at the viciousness of that attack, but also just the what seems like a callous indifference to Asian suffering. I think are the emotions that are, I think, driving this urge to fix by focusing on incidents and hate crimes and punishment of individuals. But I think ultimately what we want to be able to do from moving forward is to call attention to white supremacy and the ideologies that make this kind of invisibility of Asian American suffering possible.
Okay, so Johnny, do you think that, I'm going to ask very directly, but do you think it is the Biden administration which is well placed to then deal with this issue? Is it ready to do the hard work which needs to be done?
No, I don't think what Biden is proposing has already been proposed previously before he came into office about hate crimes. But really, hate crimes are basically broadly defined as these kinds of bias incidents, right? So then what Biden is really doing is doubling down, using anti-Asian sentiments to double down on the fact that the police will get PR, public relations, good public relations for protecting Asians, supposedly, right? And we know this is not the case, that the police are not protecting anybody but the wealthy few. But this is the kind of propaganda that the Biden administration is doing. So they're really doing nothing. They say they're doing something, but they're actually doing nothing but reinforcing police power. That's the way I see it. And the proof is in the evidence itself. If you look at any of the, like the AAPI incidents survey, right? It's really incidents, broadly defined hate crimes in this way, where you have stuff like shunning and graffiti. Somebody said something about the belongingness of Asian Americans. They're defining it as hate crime. Hate crime itself in U.S. law is a crime motivated by bias. That's what it is. So those are not what people are describing in those surveys, saying that this tremendous surge has occurred since the pandemic. And yes, some of that has, but it is broadly defined. It becomes problematic, and it's reinforcing police power. That's what I think.
Okay, so how does one then deal with that issue, Sumie, of the various issues that the various races and ethnicities within the U.S. face, right? I mean, is there a unified strategy which can be brought about to deal with white supremacy across that spectrum? I mean, because then there's that whole argument, right, on the part of many, and I know that this argument's been debated and proven incorrect, but of reverse racism, of white guilt, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, how does one deal with this in a reasonable fashion, do you think?
Yes, and I think ultimately what has to happen is that Asian American individuals and groups need to form coalitions, alliances, and accomplices with other Black Americans, Brown Americans, Indigenous Americans, and white allies to be able to call out the larger ideology of white supremacy and bias, xenophobia, anti-Black racism, anti-Asian racism, in order to be able to say that there are different ways in which racism and xenophobia and anti-immigrant sentiments affect Asian Americans and other people of color that are racialized in this country to be made less than, to be dehumanized, and to be able to be made invisible in some ways, or hyper visible in some other ways, and to recognize that the work that needs to be done going forward is really dismantling racism in any form, rather than to focus particularly on how to define particular incidents of hate, or how to protect any particular minority groups. I think the larger issue, on hand, is to work together toward dismantling racism in any form.
And I don't want to get away from the topic, of course, but just as a final thought, we know that the George Floyd trial right now is ongoing, the Derek Chauvin trial, in fact, I should say, the officer who killed George Floyd. And I'm just wondering, how important would it be for there to be a proper accountability and justice in that case, as then a precedent and as that public accountability of this officer to then send the message that, hey, we will go after anyone who carries out such a crime?
Well, I mean, there are multiple things that should occur. Just because if they convict Derek Chauvin, and the evidence is overwhelming that they should, but if they convict Derek Chauvin, that's just one conviction. The problem is systemic. It is structural, as I've been trying to say. This runs deep. The police exist to basically control anybody who is not defined as white. Their bodies, their minds, as the speaker was referring to, right? So she's quite correct that there needs to be coalescing between the various groups who are being racialized and exposed to racial terror, white racial terror. We should band together to stop this as a unit. This is a structural problem. We cannot continue to use the discourse of hate, which individualizes the problem rather than structuralizes it, so we can address the overall systemic nature of it. That's the only way we can do it. So one conviction of Derek Chauvin will not solve this problem, right? There's just a modicum of justice for the family. We need overall kinds of radical structural reform, the abolition of the police as we know it, a new system in its place. That's what we need.
We'll leave it there at that, but we hope that was a good conversation for our viewers as well, to understand specifically the context, right, about not just anti-Asian American racism within the United States, but also just racism as a whole within the country. Again, not just limited to the pandemic context. However, that context is also extremely important to discuss. Why have we had, for example, 150% increase in anti-Asian hate crimes being reported in the U.S.'s largest cities just in the year 2020. That's according to the Center for Study of Hate and Extremism in California State University. The George Floyd trial, or the officer who killed him, his trial is ongoing. Will that be a message that will be sent to anybody who may even have such racist thoughts, that is unacceptable, that they should not and cannot be acting out in that in any fashion and expect to get away with it? Then, as Johnny mentioned a number of times, I mean, there are relations, and the relations with the police in the country and with the system as a whole are problematic. We also spoke with Sumie about, white supremacy as a whole and the ideology being the problem at this point in time. This has been something that we've discussed previously, of course, here in Scope as well. Will the Biden administration be the one to be able to tackle this issue of white supremacy properly? So far, as Johnny was saying, the signs are not good. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Okar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.